Most television shows contain exactly what they appear to contain. A joke that lands once and stays where it was left. A background that fills the frame and means nothing beyond it. The Simpsons has been running since 1989, and somewhere across those thousands of episodes, the writers started hiding things inside things. There is the number flashing on a supermarket scanner for less than a second that turns out to be a real economic statistic. There is the hidden film nobody connected for nearly 2 decades, assembled from clips everyone had already seen. There is the classroom number linking this cartoon to every Pixar film ever made. There is the former Beatle who recorded a real recipe backwards and buried it in the closing credits. There is the secret inside Marge Simpson's hair placed there before the show had aired a single episode. And there is the blackboard equation pointing toward a subatomic particle 14 years before scientists confirmed it existed. Tonight, this video walks slowly through the things the writers buried deep enough that it took decades to find them. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's get started. The hidden movie nobody noticed for almost 20 years. The Simpsons has always been watched in pieces. An episode here, a rerun there, a clip shared online, a scene remembered from childhood but slightly wrong in the memory. That is the natural rhythm of a show that has been running longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. People watch what is in front of them, and they move on. What they rarely do is line up the pieces in order and ask whether the pieces, taken together, form something larger than the sum of what they have seen. That is exactly why it took until 2011 for anyone to notice what the writing staff had done in the early 1990s. Across the second, third, and fourth seasons of the show, nobody sat down and watched all of the McBain clips back to back because there was no obvious reason to do so. They were just clips. Small segments of a fictional action film that the Simpson family watched on television. They came and went in a few seconds each. They were funny on their own terms, a quick send-up of the kind of muscle-bound, one-liner heavy action movies that dominated theaters in the late 80s and early 90s. The joke, as far as most people understood it, was that Springfield had terrible taste in cinema, that the Simpsons family watched schlocky films the same way real families did, and that the names and lines of this fictional movie were deliberately stupid and deliberately funny. That was all. Then someone lined the clips up in sequence, and the internet changed its mind entirely. Rainier Wolfcastle is one of the more quietly brilliant recurring characters in the history of the show. He is the fictional action star of Springfield, a walking parody of a very specific kind of celebrity. The enormous, Austrian, barely articulate movie idol whose fame is entirely divorced from any recognizable human quality. His movies play on the Simpsons family television the way real action films played on real American television. His catchphrases are designed to be exactly as grammatically broken and physically impossible as the catchphrases real action stars used. His contempt for danger and for logic is total. He is, in the most affectionate possible way, a portrait of a certain kind of absurdity that mainstream Hollywood spent an entire decade producing with a straight face. Within the Rainier Wolfcastle universe, there is a character called McBain. McBain is the role Wolfcastle is most associated with, the franchise that defines his fictional career. He is a former police officer with a deep personal vendetta, a partner who dies in front of him, and an enemy who must be stopped. The details of the McBain saga are lifted so directly from the playbook of 80s action cinema that they function as a precise catalog of every cliché the genre produced. The wisecracking boss who refuses to take the hero seriously, the loyal partner killed moments after mentioning retirement, the conspiracy that goes right to the top, the villain with too much power and too little fear, the hero who goes rogue, the impossible final showdown. Every single one of these elements is present in the McBain material that the show produced across its early seasons. Every single one is presented with complete deadpan commitment, as though Rainier Wolfcastle himself genuinely believes in the artistic merit of what he is doing. The first McBain clip appeared in a Season 2 episode airing in 1991. It was a brief segment during which Homer and Marge watched television. In it, a former police officer named McBain confronted his superior with evidence of a senator's involvement in an international drug operation. The boss dismissed the evidence. McBain responded by grabbing the captain and throwing him through a window. The clip lasted less than a minute and was played entirely for laughs. The Schwarzenegger reference was obvious. The joke was immediate. And then the story continued, and the McBain clip was filed in the memory as a funny background detail. 3 episodes later, still in the second season, another McBain clip appeared. This time, the scene was a diner called Sloppy Joe's. McBain sat across from his partner, Scoey, a man 2 days from retirement who was looking forward to going home. The camera cut to the waiter behind the counter, who produced a gun. Scoey jumped in front of the shot meant for McBain. On the floor, dying, Scoey delivered his last words, "Find Mendoza, get the senator." The clip was brief. The joke was the perfect absurdity of the dying partner scene, the cliché pushed to its most compressed and ridiculous form. And then the episode moved on. More clips followed in later episodes, always brief, always landing during a scene where a member of the Simpson family was watching television. McBain obtained a bigger weapon. He destroyed the police manual that stood between him and revenge. He infiltrated a gathering of Mendoza's criminal associates by disguising himself as an ice sculpture, a joke that generated the line most fans remember from the McBain footage, a line delivered in Wolfcastle's clunky, Schwarzenegger-adjacent English as he stepped out of the ice and greeted the senator. Later still, he was captured, escaping just in time for a final confrontation. The last clip in the sequence showed Mendoza falling, the mission complete, the partner avenged, the case closed. The credits of whatever episode had hosted that final clip rolled on, and nobody connected any of it. Al John, who served as executive producer and showrunner during the periods in which these clips were produced, and who had been with the show from its earliest days, has spoken about the McBain material in interviews since the discovery was made. The original pitch for the McBain character came from Sam Simon, Mike Reiss, and Gene himself, developed for a script written by Jeff Martin during the second season. The clip was received well enough that when Gene and others began writing another episode, they decided to revisit the character and include another installment of the fictional film. And from there, the tradition continued. Each clip developed as a parody of a different stock action movie scene, without any explicit plan to create a continuous narrative. The individual clips were jokes. What they accumulated into was something else. What makes the discovery so remarkable in retrospect is that the narrative they form is not loose or approximate. It is a complete story. It has a setup, a complication, a reversal, a descent, a capture, and a resolution. The genre tropes are all present and accounted for. A viewer could watch the assembled McBain footage without any knowledge of the Simpsons episodes it came from, and follow the whole thing as a coherent, if extremely brief, action film. The fact that this coherence was apparently a mixture of intentional design and happy accident, a parody that grew into a story through accumulated affection and recurring commitment, made it more interesting to fans, not less. It is the kind of discovery that rewards the question of how carefully anyone was actually watching. When a video assembling the clips in order was posted online in 2011, the reaction was immediate. The video spread across the early social web with a speed that reflected genuine surprise. Writers who covered popular culture reached for phrases like genius-level long-form storytelling. The Cracked website noted, with some affection and amusement, that the real question the discovery raised was not how clever the writers had been, but how thoroughly an audience in the 1990s had failed to notice something that, in retrospect, was visible in plain sight across 3 years of programming. The individual clips, the article pointed out, were not hidden. They were broadcast on national television to millions of viewers. They were remembered and quoted. The partner dying 2 days before retirement clip, in particular, became one of the more shared pieces of the McBain footage, celebrated as a masterful compression of a very specific movie cliché. And yet nobody asked what came before it, or what came after. The discovery was repeated, in a quieter form, when a social media account dedicated to the show shared the assembled clips again in the summer of 2024. The video spread again. The reaction was again a combination of delight and disbelief. The Newsweek piece covering the renewed interest quoted Al Jean directly. He confirmed the essential history of how the clips developed, the way individual parody moments had accumulated into something larger through the natural gravity of a creative team returning to material they enjoyed. He also revealed a detail about the broader universe. A spin-off joke in the same vein had been placed in the pilot episode of a different television series that Gene and Mike Reiss created after leaving The Simpsons. The impulse to hide a story inside a story, it seems, did not stop with McBain. Harry Shearer provided the voice of Rainier Wolfcastle throughout the character's run, and Wolfcastle went on to appear in other contexts beyond the McBain films, most notably as the actor cast to play the lead role in a failed Radioactive Man movie that became the subject of its own episode. But it is McBain that fans return to when Wolfcastle's name comes up. It is McBain that represents the thing about The Simpsons writing staff that made the golden era of the show feel unlike anything else on television at the time. The willingness to spend creative energy on something that the vast majority of the audience would never notice, simply because the writers themselves found it satisfying to build. There is something quietly moving about that creative philosophy. When considered from a distance, the clips were produced without any guarantee that anyone would ever connect them. The writers could not have known that the internet would eventually exist in a form that would allow a viewer to pull every clip from a streaming service, arrange them in order, and share the result with millions of people in a few hours. They built the hidden story anyway, apparently because they wanted to, because the joke of a parody that secretly also worked as a real genre film was funny enough on its own that it did not require an audience to appreciate it. The audience found it eventually, but the writers did not seem to need that to happen in order to justify the effort. That is a particular kind of confidence in a craft, and it shows up in other places across the show's history. The McBain movie was the most spectacular example, the one that required years and multiple episodes to assemble, and that rewarded the most sustained kind of attention. But it was not the only time the writing staff placed something in the show for the pleasure of placing it, rather than the certainty of recognition. The rest of this video is full of those moments. The McBain film just happened to be the largest of them, the one that required a full 2 decades and the architecture of the modern internet to finally come to light. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The McBain hidden movie sat inside the show for nearly 20 years, assembled from clips that felt like throwaway gags but formed a complete story nobody thought to connect. What the writers did with McBain was deliberate, sustained, and waiting to be found. The next section goes even deeper, into an idea that was scrapped before the show even had a second episode, and whose ghost has been sitting on screen ever since. Section 2. The Clown Who Was Always the Father. For most of the show's long run, fans have noticed the resemblance without quite knowing what to do with it. 2 characters in Springfield share the same bald dome, the same wide jaw, the same rounded body, the same general silhouette. One of them is the central figure of the whole series, the father, the man around whom the family orbits. The other is Springfield's most beloved television entertainer, a clown with green hair, a painted white face, a red bulb nose, and a habit of making terrible life decisions with maximum confidence. Side by side, stripped of their costuming, they are essentially the same drawing. The face is the same face. The body is the same body. The proportions match so precisely that whenever the show places them in proximity, the visual joke writes itself without a single word of dialogue. Most viewers who noticed the resemblance assumed it was a coincidence of animation economy, the kind of shared feature that occurs when a production is moving fast and a character model gets reused. Some assumed it was a deliberate visual gag, a running joke without a punchline. A few fans online developed theories over the years trying to explain the similarity in terms of the show's internal logic, proposing that the connection between the 2 characters was intentional and meaningful in ways the writing had simply never made explicit. What almost none of them knew, until Matt Groening himself began discussing it in interviews, was that the similarity was not a coincidence, not an accident of production, and not a joke without a punchline. It was the original architecture of the entire series, collapsed into a design choice that remained visible on screen across decades of episodes, long after the idea it encoded had been quietly abandoned. Groening, speaking on the NPR program Fresh Air in 2003, was direct about what Krusty the Clown was supposed to be. He described the design in those terms. The character was originally Homer in clown garb. The satirical idea at the heart of the early show, as Groening explained it, was that the series was about a boy who had no respect for his own father, but who worshipped a clown who looked exactly like that father. The comedy of that situation, in Groening's original conception, was as dark and as precise as anything the show ever produced. Bart idolized Krusty with a devotion he could never extend to Homer. He covered his room in Krusty merchandise. He organized his enthusiasm around Krusty's television appearances. He treated Krusty as a figure of genuine cultural importance, and none of that respect, none of that reverence, none of that warmth extended even slightly in the direction of the man sitting at the dinner table every night, who was, in the original plan, the exact same person wearing a different costume. The plan, as Groening and others have described it across various interviews, was to reveal the connection on screen. The specific scenario that circulated in the early creative conversations involved Bart attending a taping of the Krusty the Clown show. During the visit, the boy would begin to suspect that the clown performing in front of him was somehow an imposter. The suspicion would build, and at the key moment, Bart would pull off Krusty's signature red nose and reveal, underneath all the paint and the costume, the face of his father. The joke would be that Homer, having gone to the extraordinary lengths of maintaining a secret celebrity identity, still could not not earn the love and respect of his own son, because his son's love and respect were directed entirely at the persona he was performing. The disguise would have been irrelevant. Bart's devotion to Krusty was so separate from his feelings about Homer that the revelation of their shared identity would not have resolved anything. It is a genuinely dark idea. There is something almost tragic in the concept of a parent who creates an alter ego specifically as a way of earning a child's affection, only to find that the affection remains attached to the performance and cannot transfer to the performer. A more serious show would have milked it for pathos. The Simpsons, even in its original conception, would have played it as comedy, but the comedy would have been rooted in something real about the way children and parents sometimes fail to see each other. The image of Homer removing his makeup and Bart feeling nothing except perhaps disappointment is both funny and genuinely unpleasant in a way the early show was unafraid to be. Groening has been candid in the same interviews about why it never happened. The pace of producing a full television series, as opposed to the short animated sketches the show had originally been commissioned to make for a comedy variety program, was simply overwhelming. The writing staff was moving as fast as it could to produce episode after episode. The Homer is Krusty concept required a level of serialized storytelling, a narrative arc that built across episodes toward a reveal that the production pace could not easily accommodate. Groening recalled making the decision in relatively simple terms. The twist was too complicated, and the show was moving too fast, and so they dropped it. When he looks at Krusty now, he has said, he still sees Homer. The thought has never entirely left him, but the reveal that was supposed to make it explicit never came. What remained once the concept was discarded was the design. Krusty kept the face that had been built to match Homer's. Dan Castellaneta, who had been cast to voice both characters precisely because the original plan required a single performer to play two sides of the same character, kept both roles. The voice Castellaneta developed for Krusty is distinct from his Homer voice, gruff and raspy where Homer is warm and round, carrying the weight of a lifetime of cigarettes and cynicism where Homer carries the weight of comfortable ignorance. But they come from the same actor and for a specific reason. The show had once needed them to be the same person, and the casting choice outlasted the concept it was made to serve. The early seasons of the show played with the visual similarity in ways that worked as jokes without requiring any awareness of the original plan behind them. In the first season episode where Krusty is arrested and brought to court, the clown appears without his makeup for what turned out to be one of the very few times the show would depict him that way. In the courtroom, stripped of the green hair and the painted face and the red nose, Krusty sits in a prison uniform and looks essentially like Homer in slightly different clothes. The joke is visible, immediate, and does not require explanation. By the sixth season, the episode known by fans as Homie the Clown took the visual similarity and built an entire plot around it. Homer enrolls in a training school that Krusty has established to produce performers who can appear in his place at public events. Homer graduates. He puts on the costume and the makeup, and because the face underneath is already so close to the face above the costume, he becomes indistinguishable from Krusty himself. The Springfield Mafia, pursuing Krusty over gambling debts, cannot tell the two of them apart. The climax of the episode requires both characters to be present in the same location, and the visual confusion that follows is only possible because of a design decision made in a creative meeting years before the show had aired a single full episode. According to production sources, the show's animators and producers had long discussions throughout the early seasons about whether Krusty should ever be depicted without his makeup after the first season courtroom scene. The eventual decision was that it didn't particularly matter, and the show settled into treating Krusty as a character who existed permanently in his performance identity. Later episodes developed the additional explanation that Krusty's pale complexion was not theatrical grease paint at all, but rather a permanent skin condition, the result of decades of heavy smoking and multiple cardiac episodes. In one episode, he is told he looks healthy, points at his face, and announces that it is not makeup. The show found a way to absorb the visual fact of his resemblance to Homer into Krusty's own medical history, folding what had once been a plot device into something that functioned as simple character texture. What the abandoned twist leaves behind is a question about what the show might have been if Groening's original satirical concept had survived into the series proper. The show that actually aired explored the relationship between Homer and Bart across decades of episodes, finding real warmth and real frustration and real comedy in their dynamic, without ever requiring the kind of dramatic revelation the early plan proposed. Krusty became one of the richest supporting characters the show produced, a genuinely complicated figure whose Jewish heritage, his estrangement from his rabbi father, his addictions, his financial disasters, and his moments of unexpected decency were developed across dozens of episodes in ways that would have been impossible if he had remained a costume Homer occasionally wore. The abandonment of the original concept made room for something better than the concept could have provided, and yet the ghost of the original idea is right there on screen every time Krusty appears. The face is still Homer's face. The voice is still Dan Castellaneta's voice. The design still carries its original meaning, encoded into the character's visual identity at the very beginning, before the show had found its footing, before it knew what it was going to be. Fans who discovered the history of the concept found that it reframed everything they had already seen, not as a twist that needed to be revealed, but as a different way of looking at something they had been watching for years without quite registering what they were seeing. The clown had always been the father. The makeup had always been the only thing separating them. Bart had always been worshipping the man he refused to respect, without knowing it, across every episode the show ever made. That is the kind of discovery that works best when it arrives quietly, without drama, as a realization rather than a revelation. Nobody pulled off the red nose. Nobody yanked back the curtain. The information arrived in interviews, in DVD commentaries, in an NPR conversation between a journalist and the man who created the whole thing. And once it settled in, the screen looked slightly different than it had before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The original plan for Homer and Krusty was dropped before the show even found its footing, but the design it left behind has been visible in every episode ever since. Up next, the section moves further back still, to a secret that Groening intended to keep hidden for the entire run of the show, one that was encoded into a character's appearance on the very first day of production, and was only ever partially revealed in a children's arcade game. Section 3. What was always hiding under the blue hair? Before the Simpsons were the Simpsons. Before Springfield existed. Before Homer had a name, or Bart had a skateboard, or Lisa had a saxophone. Matt Groening was a cartoonist in Los Angeles with a comic strip and no television career. The strip was called Life in Hell. It had been running since the late 1970s, picked up by the Los Angeles Reader in 1980, and it had grown from a self-published curiosity into a nationally distributed alternative newspaper comic with a devoted readership. Its central characters were anthropomorphic rabbits, a sad, overbite-heavy figure named Binky, his partner Sheba, their one-eared son Bongo, and a pair of identical, ill-tempered roommates called Akbar and Jeff. The strip was wry and dark and deeply personal, a weekly report on the small indignities and existential frustrations of adult life, delivered through the mouths of rabbits who were clearly not coping well. It was not a mainstream success. It was the kind of success that the alternative press produced in that era. Deeply loyal readers, genuine cultural cachet, zero money. That strip was the thing James L. Brooks had seen when he reached out to Groening in the mid-1980s. Brooks was producing a television variety program called The Tracy Ullman Show for Fox, and he wanted short animated segments to fill the space between the show's live comedy sketches and its commercial breaks. He had been introduced to Life in Hell and found it interesting enough to contact the cartoonist directly. The offer, as it was presented, was an opportunity to bring the strip to a new audience through television, with the production resources of a real network behind it. For a comic strip artist whose work had never generated the kind of income that name recognition might suggest, it was a significant proposition. Groening went to Brooks's office for the pitch meeting. He intended, as he has explained in multiple interviews over the years, to pitch an animated version of his existing characters, the rabbits, Binky and Bongo and the rest of the Life in Hell cast. That was the plan. And then, sitting in the lobby outside the office waiting for the meeting to begin, he thought through the implications of what he was about to agree to and felt the first flutter of real concern. The deal, as he understood it, would require him to sign over significant rights to his Life in Hell characters. The strip was the creative work he had built from nothing and sustained for nearly a decade. Handing control of it to a television production meant accepting a level of risk to something that felt genuinely irreplaceable. He made a decision, there in the waiting room, in the few minutes available to him. He would not pitch the rabbits. He would pitch something new. What he produced in that lobby, working from memory and instinct in the time it took for a meeting to begin, was a family. 5 of them. A father named after his own father. A mother named after his own mother. 2 daughters borrowed from his sisters. A son whose name was an anagram of the word brat, because Groening decided that a name that encoded its own meaning was funnier than a name that simply sounded right. They were drawn quickly, rough and unpolished, the outlines of characters rather than fully realized figures. They were yellow. Their design was simple enough that a cartoonist under pressure could produce them without a desk or reference materials, and they were the Simpsons. The creative pivot was total and instantaneous, but it was not quite complete. Groening had spent years living inside Life in Hell. Its characters and their visual vocabulary were not things he could simply set aside. He had designed this new family in a matter of minutes, and he had given them their own logic and their own look. But he wanted some thread, some small private connection between the world he was leaving behind and the world he was entering. And the thread he chose was Marge. The mother of the Simpson family was given a hairdo unlike anything that had appeared on a cartoon character before. The blue beehive, piled into a structure that added several feet to her already considerable height, was drawn with a specific purpose in mind. Groening's plan, as he would confirm years later on the DVD commentary for a season 4 episode, was that Marge's hair was concealing a pair of rabbit ears. Long, pale, unmistakably rabbit ears, tucked up inside the enormous blue tower of her hairstyle, invisible as long as the hair remained in place, and irreversible the moment it came down. The design was a secret embedded in the character from her very first sketch. Every time audiences watched Marge moving through her domestic life in Springfield, they were watching a character whose most fundamental visual fact was a concealment. The plan for the reveal was modest and deeply personal. Groening wanted to save it for the final episode of the series. In that last installment, whenever it came, Marge would let her hair down, or something would cause it to collapse, or some situation would arise that required the ears to finally be seen. And in that closing moment, in the last minutes of whatever the finale turned out to be, the show would acknowledge what it had been from the beginning. A sideways extension of Life in Hell, dressed in a new costume, hiding its origins under a tower of blue hair. It was a private joke stretched across the entire run of the series, a connection between two creative worlds that only Groening himself fully understood, waiting patiently for a final episode to make it legible. The other people working on the show had a different reaction to this plan when they heard it. Sam Simon, who served as co-developer of the series alongside Groening and James L. Brooks, was not a supporter of the rabbit ear concept in any form. Accounts of the writers' room discussions suggest that Simon's response was direct and not particularly gentle. The idea was ridiculous. It was too bizarre, even for a show that had cheerfully established itself as willing to go anywhere. A cartoon family leading an exaggerated but broadly recognizable domestic life in a fictional American town occupied a different register from a reveal that the mother had been a 6-foot anthropomorphic rabbit the entire time. The two things did not inhabit the same creative universe. The other writers agreed. The concept was dropped. Groening himself has acknowledged in interviews that the idea did not survive long into the actual production of the series. Whether it was scrapped before the first season aired, or during it, or shortly after, the result was the same. The rabbit ears never appeared on the television show. The beehive remained exactly what it appeared to be, an unusual and impractical hairstyle with no hidden cargo. The characters of Life in Hell did not cross over into Springfield. The private connection Groening had tried to preserve from his old creative life to his new one was formally severed. Marge Simpson became her own character entirely, without ears or any other biological link to the strip she had been loosely designed to honor, except for one place. When Konami, the Japanese game developer, began work on an arcade game based on the show in 1990, the project was developed in close proximity to the show's early production. The game needed to use reference material from the series, and it needed to make creative decisions about how to depict the characters in the interactive context of a beat-em-up arcade title. The communication between the television production and the licensed games development team was not seamless, as often happened in the early days of merchandise licensing, when a show's internal creative decisions did not always travel cleanly to every partner working with the property simultaneously. And so the arcade game went to market in 1991, carrying something the television show had already formally abandoned. When Marge appears in the game and gets hit by an electrical shock, her skeleton flashes briefly on screen in the style of a classic cartoon electrocution gag. In that flash, for a fraction of a second, the outline of her skeletal form includes two long ears rising from the top of her skull. When she uses her vacuum cleaner as a melee weapon, and the suction catches her own hair, pulling it upward momentarily, the same ears are briefly visible underneath. They are not subtle if a player knows to look for them. They are the rabbit ears from Life in Hell, preserved in a licensed game because the Konami development team had been working from reference materials that reflected the original plan before it was abandoned, and the gap in communication between the game's production and the television writer's room meant the scrapped concept slipped through unchanged. Binky, the main character of Life in Hell, even makes a direct cameo appearance in the game's level introduction sequences, walking across the screen between stages. The strip's most recognizable figure shows up inside a Simpsons arcade game as a bridge between the two creative universes that the show itself had chosen not to acknowledge. The game is, in this sense, a small museum of an idea that the television production outgrew before it ever went public. A place where the secret graining had embedded in Marge's design is briefly and accidentally legible before the hair falls back into place and the cartoon world goes on as if nothing was ever hidden there at all. The Beehive has its own separate and publicly acknowledged origin story, which exists entirely apart from the rabbit ear secret. Groening has noted in interviews that the style was partly inspired by his own mother's hairdo from the 1960s, and partly by The Bride of Frankenstein, the iconic 1935 film in which Elsa Lanchester's character wears an elaborate structured hairstyle that became one of cinema's most recognizable images. Both of those references explain the specific shape and height of the Blue Tower without touching the hidden logic underneath it. The hair was drawn to look the way it does for reasons that have nothing to do with rabbits, and the rabbit secret was layered inside a design that already had its own coherent visual reasoning. That double origin is one of the things that makes it so easy to miss. The hair makes sense without the ears. It always has. The ears were never visible to anyone who was not told to look for them, and the people who made the show decided, early enough that almost no one outside the production would ever know the difference, that the look for the ears was something they simply were not going to ask the audience to do. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marge's hair has been hiding a secret since before the show had its first broadcast episode, and that secret only ever surfaced in the brief, flickering frames of a Konami arcade game. The next section moves from what was hidden inside a character to what was hidden inside the opening credits of every early episode, a number that flashed on screen for a fraction of a second and turned out to be a precise economic statement about the cost of raising a child in America in 1989. Section 4. The number that flashes in every opening somewhere in the first few seconds of every early episode, before the story begins and before the couch gag lands, there is a moment so brief that most viewers never registered it as anything other than visual noise. The family is moving through its opening ritual. Homer is leaving the power plant. Bart is finishing his chalkboard punishment and racing out of school. Lisa is being escorted out of band practice for playing something too ambitious. Marge is pushing a shopping cart through a supermarket, her groceries stacked in a pile, and then a small, specific thing happens. Maggie, sitting somewhere in the cart, gets picked up by the cashier and passed across the scanner like a piece of merchandise. The register reads her. A number flashes on the small screen above the checkout lane, and then the moment is over, lasting less than a second, and the opening sequence moves on to the couch. For the vast majority of the show's first viewers, that number was simply a blur. Supermarket scanners produce numbers when they scan things. The joke was that Maggie was being scanned at all, that she was sitting there amid the groceries and the cashier just ran her over the sensor without breaking stride, as if a baby in a shopping cart was the most ordinary thing to process at a checkout. The number itself seemed incidental, a random string of digits to make the screen look real. Nobody paused the tape to read it, because there was no obvious reason to pause the tape to read it. The number was $847.63. It was not random. It was not chosen for visual balance or because it looked plausible on a tiny screen. Matt Groening has confirmed in various contexts over the years that the figure was a deliberate and specific choice, a real statistic from a real source, embedded in the opening of every episode with the same casual intention as everything else the writing staff buried in plain sight across the show's history. In 1989, when The Simpsons first aired on Fox, $847.63 represented the estimated average monthly cost of raising a child in the United States. That is a precise and pointed piece of information to encode into a fraction of a second visual gag. The entire joke, played out in silence and at a speed that made it nearly impossible to consciously process in real time, was that Maggie cost exactly as much as a child costs. That the supermarket scanner was not producing a random number but a real one, rooted in a real American economic reality, a quiet acknowledgement that the family at the center of the show was carrying the weight of something that genuinely adds up. The Simpsons presented itself as a portrait of a recognizable working-class household, a family that struggled with money in the same ways real families struggled with money, and the number on the register was one of the show's earliest and most understated ways of grounding that portrait in something factual. Maggie was not simply a baby. She was, in economic terms, a cost that the show was willing to quantify and flash on screen every week, in the full confidence that almost no one would notice it was there. The discovery arrived for most viewers at the point when home video technology advanced far enough that pausing and freezing a specific frame became genuinely easy. In the early years of the show's run, watching a moment that lasted less than a second in any kind of careful detail required a well-timed finger on a VCR remote, and most people did not apply that level of scrutiny to an opening credit sequence they had already seen dozens of times. As the show moved to DVD and eventually to streaming, the pause became effortless, and the number that had been sitting in the opening of every classic-era episode finally became legible to a wide audience. The reaction when the discovery spread, first through fan forums and then through wider media coverage, was the particular delight that attaches to any secret that turns out to have been hiding in plain sight for years. People went back and watched the opening with new attention, registered the number, looked it up, and found that it was exactly what Groening had said it was. The joke had been true the whole time. It had just been moving too fast for anyone to catch. The original figure stayed in place across the early years of the show. As the series moved toward the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, the opening sequence itself began to change, acquiring new gags and new variations that reflected the show's evolving relationship with its own format. The longest-running animated program in American television history eventually found it necessary to revisit the opening in a more comprehensive way, and a full redesign of the sequence was introduced in 2009, when the show moved to high-definition production and a widescreen format. The new opening retained the basic structure of the old one, the same sequence of events, the same characters moving through the same Springfield geography, but it was rebuilt from the ground up, with new animation and a wider frame. Maggie still went through the scanner. The register still displayed a number, but the number had changed. In the updated version, the cashier rings up Marge's groceries first, producing a total of $243.26. When Maggie is scanned, that total doubles exactly, climbing to $486.52. The precision of the doubling is not accidental. Where the original figure was a direct citation of a specific statistic, the updated gag works differently, without anchoring itself to any particular year's economic data. Instead of saying that a child costs a fixed amount, the new version says that a child doubles the price of everything else you carry. The meaning shifts from a specific number to a general principle. The joke about the expense of raising children survives the update, but it migrates from the documentary to the rhetorical, from a real figure to a structural one. Groening and the production team, it seems, made a quiet decision somewhere in those years that tying the gag to the specific 1989 estimate was a kind of time capsule they were no longer interested in maintaining. The cost of a child had changed, the statement had not. What makes this particular Easter egg distinct from most of the others scattered through the show's history is the nature of its concealment. The McBain movie required a viewer to actively assemble pieces from multiple episodes. The Krusty and Homer connection required knowledge of a creative decision that had never been made public. The rabbit ears under Marge's hair required access to an arcade game or a DVD commentary track. But the number on the register was there in every episode, every week, in a sequence that millions of people watched on broadcast television and then again in reruns for years afterward. It was not hidden in the background of a single frame or buried in a DVD extra. It was in the opening. It was the kind of thing that required no special effort to encounter and every kind of effort to actually see, because seeing it required slowing down something that the medium encouraged you to absorb at full speed and move past without examination. That gap between encountering something and actually perceiving it is one of the things the show exploited with particular consistency across its golden era. The writing staff had a well-documented fondness for gags that rewarded attention without demanding it, jokes that worked on one level for the casual viewer and on a second or third level for whoever happened happen to pause the tape or read the background or look up the reference. The register number is perhaps the purest example of that sensibility because it works entirely without the second level if a viewer never discovers the economic citation underneath it. The visual gag of Maggie being scanned is funny regardless of what the number says. The cashier picks her up and runs her over the sensor, and the joke lands in the absurdity of the action. The number is surplus, meaning additional intention layered on top of a gag that already functions without it. The writers were working in a period when television audiences could not, in any practical sense, slow down a broadcast. The show aired once a week, on a specific night, at a specific time, and whatever happened in those 22 minutes happened at the pace the production had set. Background details and split-second visual jokes existed in a space the audience could not easily access. The writing staff knew this. They placed things there anyway. The register number sat in the opening of the show for years before the format changed enough to allow the kind of careful frame-by-frame examination that could extract its meaning. By the time the audience had the tools to find it, the original number was already being phased out of the updated sequence. The discovery and the retirement happened in roughly the same era. A whole generation of viewers grew up watching the number flash on screen every week and had no idea what it meant, and another generation inherited the ability to find it just as the show was quietly replacing it with something different. That particular timing is not a tragedy. The gag served its purpose for the years it was there, whether or not any given viewer ever decoded it. And the decoding, when it happened, produced exactly the response the show had always sought from its most attentive audience: a moment of recognition and retroactive appreciation, a sense that something had been sitting there waiting to be found, and had been patient enough to keep waiting for as long as it took. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The register number was in the opening of every early episode, a real economic figure from 1989, dressed up as visual noise, moving too fast for almost anyone to catch. The next section stays inside the world of numbers but moves from the economics of parenthood to a prisoner identification number that quietly foreshadowed one of the most controversial character reveals the show ever produced. Section 5. The prisoner who was always Jean Valjean. There is a moment in the 5th season of the show that most people watched and immediately forgot. It arrives without announcement, in the middle of an episode about something else entirely, as a background detail attached to a supporting character who is not the focus of the scene. Principal Seymour Skinner, the long-suffering administrator of Springfield Elementary, is rummaging through old belongings and produces a battered military helmet from his time as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. The camera holds on the helmet just long enough to register a number stamped into the metal: 24601. The scene moves on. The episode continues. Whatever else happened in that installment occupied the attention of every viewer who watched it, and the number on the helmet was filed somewhere in the back of the mind as a period detail, a small piece of Skinner's Vietnam backstory, realistic looking and therefore invisible. 24,601 is not a number that the average viewer carries around in their head, but it is a number that anyone who has read a particular 19th century French novel or seen a particular stage musical that ran for decades in theaters across the English-speaking world recognizes instantly. It is the prisoner number of Jean Valjean, the central figure of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the man condemned to 19 years of forced labor for stealing bread to feed a starving family, who emerges from confinement haunted by his past and spends the rest of the novel trying to become someone worthy of the life he has rebuilt. The number defines him in the novel. It is the name Javert uses when he refuses to accept that a man can change. It is chanted in the musical adaptation in a way that made it one of the most recognizable strings of digits in popular culture for anyone who had encountered the story in any of its forms. 24601. The writers who placed that number on Skinner's helmet knew exactly what they were doing. It was not a coincidence. Nothing in the writing room of the Golden Era Simpsons was a coincidence of that specific kind. The staff that produced the show in those years was heavily educated, widely read, and constitutionally incapable of placing a famous literary reference into the background of a scene without understanding precisely what they were encoding and why. The number on Skinner's helmet was a promise. A quiet one, delivered in a medium that guaranteed most viewers would never catch it, about where the character's story was eventually going to go. It was a signal from the writers to themselves, and to the fraction of the audience paying close enough attention to receive it, a note in the margin of an an ongoing story that said, "This man is not who he appears to be, and we have known it since before we told you." The payoff arrived 4 seasons later, in an episode from the 9th year of the show's run called The Principal and the Pauper. It was, by any measure, one of the most dramatic and deliberately unsettling character reveals the show had ever attempted. A man named Armin Tamzarian arrives in Springfield and announces that he is the real Seymour Skinner. The principal the town has known for years, the buttoned-up, mother-dominated, emotionally repressed administrator of Springfield Elementary, is revealed to be an imposter. His actual name is not Seymour Skinner. He assumed that identity from the real Skinner after the two men served together in Vietnam, when the real Skinner was presumed dead, and the man who would become the town's principal took his name as a way of escaping a past he was not proud of, and stepping into a life that felt like an improvement on the one he had been living. The parallel to Les Miserables is precise and deliberate. Jean Valjean, released from prison and unable to find work or shelter because his criminal past follows him everywhere, eventually adopts a new identity and builds a respectable life for himself in a small town, becoming a successful businessman and eventually the mayor of the community, before the law in the form of the relentless Inspector Javert begins to close in around him. The entire arc of Hugo's novel is the story of a man living under a borrowed name, building something genuine and good on a foundation that was constructed through an act of deception, and the question of whether the goodness of the rebuilt life can outweigh the dishonesty of its origins. Skinner, in the Simpsons version, followed the same shape. A man with a troubled past, a borrowed name, a life constructed on an identity that did not belong to him, and a community that had come to depend on the version of him he had invented. The writers seeded that revelation 4 full seasons before it was delivered. The prisoner number on the helmet was the seed. For anyone who recognized it, who caught it in the moment it appeared, and connected it to Hugo's novel, the episode in Season 5 was already whispering what Season 9 would eventually say aloud. Skinner was Valjean. The number confirmed it before any other element of the story had been arranged to do so. The fact that those viewers were almost certainly a small fraction of the total audience did not diminish the gesture. The show made it anyway, because the writing staff found satisfaction in that kind of depth, in building a structure that rewarded the most attentive possible reading without withholding anything from the less attentive one. The number 24601 appears in other places across the show's history, attached to other characters in ways that suggest the writers developed genuine affection for it as a recurring reference. Sideshow Bob, whose relationship with the criminal justice system is one of the show's great running threads, carries the number on prison uniforms during various incarcerations across the series. Marge, arrested and briefly processed through the system in one episode, is assigned it as her intake number. The repetition transforms it from a single pointed reference into something more like a private frequency, a channel the show broadcast for viewers who knew what it signified. Each appearance is its own small joke, its own quiet acknowledgement of the Hugo novel that Skinner's arc was built to echo. The episode that finally delivered the Skinner revelation was not universally celebrated at the time of its airing, and it has remained one of the more disputed installments in the show's history. Many viewers and critics felt that retroactively rewriting Skinner's backstory was a creative overreach, a disruption of an established character that the show had no particularly good reason to make. The reveal that a beloved supporting character had been living under a false identity for the entire run of the series was the kind of dramatic move that a serialized drama might attempt with full commitment to the consequences, working through what the revelation meant for every relationship and storyline connected to the character. The Simpsons, as a comedy that operated within the logic of perpetual reset, could not do that. By the episode's end, the real Seymour Skinner had been dispatched back out of Springfield, Armin Tamzarian had resumed his life as Skinner, and a judge had ordered the entire town to never speak of the matter again under penalty of torture. The joke of the resolution was that the show was aware of its own inability to follow through on the implications of what it had done, and it chose to name that awareness directly rather than pretend the problem did not exist. Whether that resolution satisfied viewers or frustrated them depended largely on what they wanted from the show and what they thought the show owed them in terms of narrative consistency. Al John, who has served as showrunner for much of the show's later run, has acknowledged over the years that the episode is a complicated one in the series' legacy. The creative intent was genuine, the parallel to Les Miserables was built with care, and stretched across seasons in ways that demonstrated real commitment to the underlying idea. The execution, constrained by the fundamental structure of a comedy series that cannot permanently alter its own characters without disrupting the equilibrium that makes the show function, produced an ending that deliberately undermined what the setup had promised. What the episode did not undermine, and what remains intact regardless of any argument about whether the reveal worked, is the patience of the setup. 4 seasons of a number sitting on a helmet, waiting. 4 seasons during which any viewer who recognized the reference could have begun assembling the shape of what the show was telling them, adding up the details of Skinner's character against the template of Hugo's protagonist, and finding the outline of a match. The Vietnam backstory. The sense of a man perpetually constrained by a past he could not escape. The formality and rigidity of a person who had constructed a respectable identity through sustained effort rather than inherited ease. The complicated relationship with a mother whose hold over him suggested a man who had never fully separated himself from the version of his life that came before the one he was living. All of it fits against the Valjean template if a viewer is looking for the fit. The number told them to look. There is a broader principle visible in the Skinner reveal that applies to much of what the show produced in its peak years. The writing staff thought in longer arcs than the episodic format of a weekly comedy typically demands or rewards. They planted things they could not be certain would ever pay off, references that required years to resolve, and that were delivered to audiences who had no particular reason to remember a single number glimpsed for a second in a Season 5 episode when they sat down to watch a Season 9 story about an imposter. The connection was available to anyone who had been paying comprehensive attention across 4 years of television, and that is a demanding standard for a casual audience. The show met it anyway, not because it expected every viewer to achieve that level of attention, but because the act of building that kind of structure was itself part of what the writing room was doing, a form of craft satisfaction that existed somewhat independent of whether the audience received the full depth of what was being constructed. The number 24601 is one of the most elegant examples of that practice in the show's history, precisely because it operates on such different levels for different viewers. For someone who has never encountered Les Miserables in any form, it is a prop detail on a military helmet, realistic looking and functionally invisible. For someone who knows the number but does not connect it to Skinner's eventual storyline, it is a pleasant literary reference, a small gift for the attentive viewer, self-contained and satisfying. For the viewer who recognized the number, remembered it, and was watching when The Principal and the Pauper aired 4 seasons later, it was the moment the show revealed that it had known this story all along, that the helmet in the 5th season was not decoration but direction, and that the writers had been patient enough to let the setup breathe for 4 full years before exhaling. That patience is the thing that distinguishes the reference from a simple Easter egg. A simple Easter egg is a hidden object planted for the pleasure of discovery, self-contained and complete once found. The Skinner number was something closer to a structural element, a load-bearing piece of a story that the show had not yet told. It was doing narrative work at a distance, across years, in a format that gave the audience no particular incentive to accumulate and cross-reference the small details of a supporting character's backstory. The show trusted that some viewers would do that accumulation anyway, and it honored that trust by making the accumulation mean something when the time came. Whether it ultimately paid off in a way that felt commensurate with the setup is a question the show left deliberately open, resolved in the comedic sense without being resolved in the dramatic one. Armin Tamzarian went back to being Seymour Skinner. The town agreed under judicial compulsion to pretend none of it had happened. The number 24601 continued to appear in later episodes, on Sideshow Bob's uniform, on other characters passing through the justice system, a recurring presence that the show had never fully explained and never fully abandoned. Hugo's prisoner kept haunting Springfield long after the episode that named him had technically been erased from the town's collective memory. The reference outlasted the resolution. The number was still there, still broadcasting on its quiet frequency, for anyone still listening. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The number on Skinner's helmet was a 4-season promise about a character the show had been building toward a revelation for years, a literary reference doing quiet structural work inside a comedy that most people watched without ever pausing to decode it. The next section crosses into the second half of this video and into the world of the show's most deliberately hidden visual signatures, beginning with a classroom number that connects The Simpsons to to every Pixar film ever made and to one of the most widespread insider traditions in the history of American animation. Section 6. The classroom that haunts every frame. There is a number that appears in every Pixar film ever made. It is in Toy Story, on a license plate. It is in Finding Nemo, on the model designation of a diver's underwater camera. It is carved into the stonework above a doorway in Brave. It appears on a train car in Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse, on a prison cell in Kung Fu Panda, etched into a dragon's tail in How to Train Your Dragon, embedded in courtroom signage in Up, and tucked into the background of Inside Out 2 as recently as 2024. It shows up in live-action productions, in Marvel films, in episodes of Doctor Who, in animated series that have no formal connection to Pixar or Disney whatsoever. The number is A113, and it began, as all of these things begin, with a room. The California Institute of the Arts, known almost universally as Cal Arts, sits in the city of Valencia, north of Los Angeles, and has functioned for decades as one of the most consequential training grounds for animators in the world. The school produced a generation of artists and directors who went on to define what American animation looked and felt like across the 1990s and into the decades that followed. John Lasseter, who became the creative force behind Pixar and eventually the chief creative officer of the entire Disney animation operation, studied there. Pete Docter, who directed Up and Inside Out and Soul, studied there. Tim Burton studied there. Brad Bird, who directed The Iron Giant and The Incredibles and Ratatouille, studied there. Chris Sanders, who created Lilo and Stitch, studied there. The list extends further than any single paragraph can comfortably hold. Room A113 was where graphic design and character animation students did their work. It was a classroom, nothing more, with the ordinary features of any institutional learning space. Desks, equipment, the particular quality of light that comes through windows, designed for practical visibility rather than aesthetic pleasure. The students who occupied it were talented and ambitious and aware, even in those years, that they were learning a craft that might take them somewhere significant. What they could not have known was that the room number itself would follow them out of the building, into their careers, and eventually into virtually every piece of animated film that their collective output would produce across the following 4 decades. Brad Bird has spoken about the A13 tradition more explicitly than most of the other CalArts alumni who use it. He described it in an interview as his version of a practice used by the caricaturist Al Hirschfeld, who spent his career hiding the name of his daughter Nina inside every drawing he published, tucking the letters into the lines of a subject's clothing or hair, making the search for Nina a game that readers of his work played for decades. Bird said that A113 was his version of that practice, a personal signature embedded in the work, a way of marking something as having come from a particular place and a particular tradition. He stated directly that he placed it into every single one of his films, and extended that to include his episodes of The Simpsons, where the number appears across multiple installments produced during the 8 seasons when Bird served as a writer, director, storyboard artist, character designer, and executive consultant on the show. Bird's tenure on The Simpsons ran through the show's formative years, from the earliest episodes through a period that overlaps almost entirely with what most fans consider the golden era of the series. His influence on the visual language and storytelling approach of that era was substantial, and A113 traveled with him into every episode he touched. The number appears in the show across at least 4 documented instances, and possibly more that have not been cataloged with the same thoroughness. In the first season episode where Krusty the Clown is arrested, A113 appears as a detail on the arrest processing documentation. In the 3rd season episode Cape Fear, it appears as Sideshow Bob's prison number during one of the characters' incarcerations. In the music-focused episode where Homer's barbershop quartet is at the center of the story, it surfaces again. In the animated short Do the Bartman, Bart's mugshot carries the designation. Each instance is brief, specific, and placed without announcement, the visual equivalent of a whispered aside to anyone who happened to be looking at exactly the right part of the frame at exactly the right moment. The broader history of how A113 became known beyond the community of people who placed it in their work is a story about the way fan culture and the internet combined to make visible what had previously been invisible. The reference existed for years, scattered across dozens of films and television episodes, without any significant public awareness of its meaning or even its consistent presence. People who noticed it in one context had no particular reason to connect it to an appearance somewhere else, because nothing in the visible fabric of the work suggested that the two occurrences were related. A license license plate number in an animated film about toys and a prison designation in an episode of a television comedy about a dysfunctional family did not obviously belong to the same tradition. They were just numbers, unremarkable in their individual contexts, requiring a specific kind of cross-referential awareness to resolve into a pattern. That cross-referential awareness developed gradually through fan communities in the late 1990s and accelerated sharply through the 2000s, as the internet provided infrastructure for the kind of collective attention that could gather instances from disparate sources and assemble them into something legible. The piece that brought widespread public attention to the tradition was the growing coverage of Pixar's Easter egg culture more generally, which became a significant topic of popular media interest around the time of the studio's major commercial and critical peak in the mid-2000s. Articles cataloging Pixar's hidden details began mentioning A113 consistently, tracing its appearances across the studio's output and noting that it seemed to occur with too much regularity to be coincidental. The CalArts connection was identified. The tradition was named, and once it was named, people began looking for it in places beyond Pixar's films and finding it. The discovery that it appeared in The Simpsons added a layer to the tradition's history that connected it to a different production context entirely. Pixar was a film studio producing feature-length animated movies with years of development time between releases, allowing for the careful, deliberate placement of Easter eggs that had become part of the studio's creative identity. The Simpsons was a weekly television series producing 22-minute episodes on a schedule that left limited room for the kind of painstaking background work that Pixar's artists could apply to a film. The presence of A113 in the show was less a part of an institutional tradition than a personal habit carried by one creative figure into a different production environment, and the contrast between the two contexts makes the appearances in the show feel slightly different from those in the films. They are the mark of an individual rather than the practice of a collective, which is in some ways a purer expression of what Bird described when he invoked the Al Hirschfeld comparison. Hirschfeld hid Nina because it pleased him to do so. Bird placed A113 because it pleased him to do so. The scale of the production was irrelevant to the impulse. What the CalArts tradition reveals, taken in its full breadth, is something interesting about the relationship between formal training and professional practice in animation. The people who passed through room A113 did not all know each other personally, did not all work together, and in some cases worked for studios that were in direct commercial competition with one another. Pixar and Disney spent years as rivals before the acquisition that united them, and during that period the animators trained at CalArts were producing work for both institutions simultaneously, each carrying the same classroom number into productions that competed for the same audience's attention and box office dollars. The number appeared on both sides of that divide without anyone apparently finding it contradictory. It was not a corporate identifier or a statement of allegiance. It was a private joke about a shared origin, legible only to the people who had been there and to the audience members who had done enough research to understand what they were looking at. The Simpsons' place in that tradition is a specific one. Bird was not the only CalArts alumnus who contributed to the show, though he was the most prominent figure in the show's history who has spoken explicitly about using the reference. The show's animation, particularly in its early seasons, drew on a community of artists and directors who had moved through the same training institutions and carried the same professional culture. The appearance of A13 in the show is documented and confirmed. What is less certain is the full extent of its use across the show's enormous run, because the series has produced more than 800 episodes across nearly 4 decades, and the kind of frame-by-frame cataloging that would be required to identify every instance of the number across that output is a project that fan communities have approached but not completed. There may be appearances that have never been publicly identified, moments where a license plate or a room number or a form designation carries the CalArts classroom number without anyone having yet noticed and reported it. That uncertainty is itself a characteristic feature of how the show's Easter eggs function at the deepest level. The most thoroughly documented ones are the ones that appeared in the show's early, most heavily rewatched seasons, the ones that benefited from the intense scrutiny that the golden era attracted from a fan base that treated close reading of the show as a genuinely worthwhile intellectual activity. The later seasons, produced at a pace and in a cultural context where that intensity of attention had somewhat diffused, are less completely cataloged. There are almost certainly things in those episodes that have not yet been found, references and hidden details that were placed by writers and animators who inherited the tradition of hiding things in plain sight and continued it without the same level of fan attention available to notice what they were doing. The A113 tradition is significant not only for what it is, but for what it represents, about how creative communities maintain continuity across time and institutional change. The CalArts classroom was a physical space that no longer functions in the way it did when Lasseter and Bird and Burton were students there. The tradition that emerged from it has outlasted the specific context that generated it, spreading through professional networks and personal habits into productions that have nothing direct to do with the original room. It has become, in the language that fan communities use, a piece of media DNA, a marker that travels with people from one production to another and persists through career changes and institutional shifts and the passage of decades. Finding it in a Simpsons episode and finding it in a Pixar film are experiences that feel qualitatively different because the productions are so different, but they point back to the same source, the same building, the same group of students working in the same room at a formative moment in their lives, leaving a mark that they apparently never stopped wanting to make. The show's participation in that tradition connects it to a broader conversation about what animation as a craft community actually looks like from the inside, how people who share a training background maintain their connection to that background as they move into professional work that takes them in very different directions. The Simpsons and Pixar are not natural companions. One is a long-running adult comedy that has spent nearly 4 decades satirizing American domestic life. The other is a film studio that has produced some of the most emotionally ambitious family entertainment of the past 30 years. They aim at different audiences and operate according to different creative logics, and yet they share a classroom number, placed by the same people who pass through the same corridor of the same institution, as a quiet reminder that everything they made in those very different professional contexts came from the same place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A113 connected The Simpsons to every Pixar film ever made through the shared training of the artists who built both. A classroom number that became a traveling signature carried from production to production across 4 decades. The next section goes deeper into the show's relationship with hidden mathematics, where a single blackboard in a single episode contained equations serious enough to engage physicists, including one that appeared to predict the mass of a subatomic particle 14 years before scientists at the world's largest particle accelerator were able to confirm it. Section 7. The Blackboard That Almost Broke Mathematics. There is an episode from the 10th season of the show in which Homer Simpson, gripped by a midlife crisis and convinced that he has wasted his potential, decides to reinvent himself as an inventor. The episode is called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, a title that positions Homer as a figure in the tradition of Thomas Edison, whose nickname was the Wizard of Menlo Park. The comparison is not flattering to Homer in the ways a more sincere show might intend it to be. His inventions are disasters. A makeup shotgun that fires cosmetics at the face, an electric hammer, an alarm that sounds when everything is fine and cannot be switched off, a reclining chair with an attached toilet, which he discovers Edison had already invented and kept private out of what Homer chooses to interpret as modesty. The episode is funny in the way the best Simpsons episodes are funny, which is to say that it is absurd on the surface and quietly precise underneath, a portrait of a particular kind of masculine anxiety about legacy and accomplishment, dressed up in the lightest possible comic clothing. Midway through the episode, there is a scene in which Homer is working at a chalkboard. He is doing what the episode has established inventors do, thinking, calculating, reaching towards something. The camera holds on the board long enough for a viewer paying close attention to register that the equations written there are not the random symbols that a production in a hurry might paste into a background to suggest scientific activity. They are real equations, specific ones, the kind that require genuine mathematical knowledge to construct and genuine mathematical knowledge to read. The kind that, if a person with the right background paused the episode and looked carefully at what was written, would produce a reaction that was something other than casual appreciation of a background detail. One of those equations, it would eventually turn out, was a calculation bearing on the mass of the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is the subatomic particle whose existence was first theorized by the physicist Peter Higgs in 1964 as a potential explanation for why certain particles possess mass at all. Higgs proposed that a field permeates all of space and that particles moving through that field interact with it in ways that give them their mass, and that the field itself should produce a corresponding particle that could, in principle, be detected experimentally. The particle remained theoretical for decades. The mathematics describing it existed. The experimental evidence did not. Finding that evidence required technology that did not yet exist when Higgs first published his work, and the search for it consumed enormous resources and decades of effort before the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland was built with sufficient power to create and record the particle under controlled conditions. The confirmation came in 2012, nearly 50 years after the original theoretical work, and Peter Higgs was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics the following year. The Simpsons episode aired in 1998, 14 years before the CERN confirmation. The equation on Homer's chalkboard, when worked through properly, produces a value for the mass of the Higgs boson that is in the right general neighborhood of the figure that the particle accelerator eventually measured. It is not precisely correct. The value Homer's blackboard generates is larger than the confirmed figure, off by a meaningful amount when the comparison is made with scientific precision, but it is in the same order of magnitude, pointing in the right direction, reflecting genuine thinking about a real physical problem, rather than decorative nonsense invented to look scientific from a distance. The man responsible for the equation was David X. Cohen, one of the writers on the show during that period, and a figure who would later become the head writer and executive producer of Futurama, the animated science fiction series that Groening developed after The Simpsons had established itself. Cohen had a background in computer science and mathematics before he entered television writing, and he brought that background with him into the writer's room with a consistency that made the show's mathematical content more sophisticated than any other comedy on television at the time. For the Homer Inventor episode, Cohen wanted the chalkboard to contain something that would function as genuine scientific content, rather than imitation of it, and he reached out to a contact in the scientific community to work on the equation. David Shiminovich, an astronomer at Columbia University who had been a friend of Cohen's since high school, contributed to the construction of the calculation. The result was an equation that was not simply plausible looking, but actually engaged with a real unsolved problem in particle physics. Simon Singh, the British science writer who holds a doctorate in particle physics from Cambridge and who spent years researching the mathematical content hidden inside The Simpsons for a book published in 2013, was the person who brought the Higgs boson equation to wide public attention. Singh was the first to work through the Homer blackboard calculation systematically and articulate clearly what the numbers were pointing at. He described it in interviews as genuinely astonishing, while being careful to note that the writers were not working in a vacuum. The mass of the Higgs boson was a known unsolved problem in physics in 1998. Physicists were actively theorizing about what the value might be, and various estimates circulated within the scientific community. Cohen, working with Shiminovich, was drawing on that existing theoretical landscape rather than producing an original calculation from nothing. But the result, embedded in a comedy episode watched by millions of people on broadcast television, was a real engagement with a real scientific question, placed in a medium and a context where nobody expected to find it. Singh described The Simpsons writing staff as the most mathematical in the history of primetime television, and the evidence for that claim extends well beyond the Homer blackboard. Al Jean, who has served as showrunner for the show across much of its run, graduated from Harvard at 20 with a mathematics degree. Cohen's background has already been noted. Jeff Westbrook, another writer who joined the show in later seasons, holds a doctorate in theoretical computer science from Princeton. The mathematical training of the writing staff was not incidental to the show's content. It was a consistent influence on the kinds of jokes the show found worth making and the kinds of details the writers chose to populate their backgrounds with, operating on the principle that a joke that only a small fraction of the audience would fully decode was still a joke worth making. The Homer blackboard was not the only location in that single episode where Cohen embedded serious mathematical content. Among the other equations visible on the chalkboard is a calculation involving a number that mathematicians with a specific interest in number theory would recognize immediately. The number 1729 appears in one of the expressions. In the history of mathematics, 1729 is known as the Hardy-Ramanujan number, named for an exchange between the British mathematician G. H. Hardy and the Indian mathematical genius Srinivasa Ramanujan. Hardy visited Ramanujan in hospital and mentioned, making conversation, that he had arrived in a taxi bearing the number 1729, which seemed to him an unremarkable number, perhaps even a dull one. Ramanujan disagreed. He pointed out immediately that 1729 is the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways, 1 cubed plus 12 cubed, and 9 cubed plus 10 cubed. Hardy recorded the exchange, and 1729 became one of the most famous numbers in the informal folklore of mathematics, a shorthand for the particular kind of mind that sees pattern and structure in quantities that appear ordinary to everyone else. Its appearance on Homer's blackboard is a greeting to anyone who knows the story, a signal that whoever wrote the equations was aware of and interested in mathematical history at a level of specificity that goes well beyond general numeracy. The 1998 Homer episode is the richest single location of mathematical Easter eggs in the show's history, but it is not the only one. The Treehouse of Horror Halloween special from 1995, 3 years earlier, contains a segment called Homer Cubed, in which Homer stumbles through a mysterious portal and finds himself in a three-dimensional computer-generated world, one of the first uses of CGI animation in the show's history, and a technical achievement that the production was visibly proud of. The segment was written by David X. Cohen, and the three-dimensional space Homer inhabits is populated with floating equations and mathematical notations that function as the wallpaper of a dimension defined by mathematical principles. Among those floating equations is one that appears to disprove Fermat's last theorem. Fermat's last theorem is one of the most famous problems in the history of mathematics. The French mathematician Pierre de Fermat wrote in the margin of a book in 1637 that he had found a proof that no three positive whole numbers could satisfy the equation where the sum of two numbers each raised to a power greater than 2 equals a third number raised to the same power. He claimed the proof was too large to fit in the margin. The proof he claimed to possess was never found. The problem resisted solution for 350 years, attracting the attention of some of the greatest mathematical minds across those centuries, before Andrew Wiles, a British mathematician working at Princeton, finally produced a complete proof in 1995, the same year the Treehouse of Horror episode aired. The proof ran to over 100 pages of dense mathematical argument and was immediately recognized as one of the landmark achievements in the history of the discipline. The equation visible in Homer's three-dimensional world appears to present a counterexample to Fermat's theorem. If it were true, it would mean that Wiles's proof was wrong, and that Fermat's problem had not actually been solved. When the episode first aired, a small number of mathematically trained viewers noticed the equation and paused their recordings to examine it more closely. Some of them tried the numbers on calculators and found that the result appeared, on the face of it, to work. Online discussions appeared in the episode's immediate aftermath, including at least one post that Singh has described in his writing about the show, in which a viewer stated with evident alarm that they had typed the numbers into their calculator and could not understand why the equation seemed to hold. The explanation is elegant and entirely characteristic of how Cohen approached mathematical humor. The equation is what mathematicians call a near-miss solution. It comes extraordinarily close to being a true counterexample without actually being one. When the full calculation is carried out to more decimal places than a standard pocket calculator displays, the equality breaks down. The two sides of the equation are not equal. They differ by a tiny amount that ordinary computational tools are too imprecise to detect. Cohen had written a computer program specifically to generate near-miss solutions to Fermat's equation, producing numbers close enough together that any calculator a viewer was likely to use would show them as equal, while any sufficiently precise mathematical analysis would reveal the gap. The goal, as Cohen described it, was to produce an equation accurate enough that people's calculators would tell them it worked, generating exactly the kind of brief, confusing alarm that the online post demonstrated. The prank required genuine mathematical sophistication to design and landed precisely as intended. The same equation, in a slightly different form, appears again in the Homer Inventor episode 3 years later, on the blackboard where the Higgs boson calculation also lives. Cohen returned to the near-miss Fermat joke, apparently because the pleasure of it had not diminished in the intervening years. The blackboard in that episode contains multiple layers of mathematical content, each one requiring a different level of engagement to access. access. The near-miss Fermat equation rewards viewers who know enough about number theory to recognize what kind of equation they are looking at. The Higgs boson calculation rewards viewers with a background in particle physics. The Hardy-Ramanujan number rewards viewers familiar with mathematical history and its informal folklore. The equations sit together on the same chalkboard, in the same scene, in a comedy episode that most viewers watched for its jokes about Homer's failed inventions and his complicated feelings about Thomas Edison. The coexistence of all those layers in a single scene is the thing that Singh found most interesting when he was researching the show's mathematical content, and it is the thing that distinguishes the blackboard scene from a simpler Easter egg. A simpler Easter egg is a single hidden reference, complete in itself, requiring one specific piece of knowledge to unlock. The Homer blackboard is something more like a nested structure, multiple references existing at different levels of specificity, each one requiring a different kind of reader to access it while remaining invisible to everyone else. The casual viewer sees a man working at a chalkboard and registers the activity as shorthand for intellectual effort. The viewer with general mathematical literacy might notice that the equations look real without being able to read them specifically. The viewer with knowledge of Fermat's theorem might catch the near-miss equation and recognize its shape. The particle physicist might catch the Higgs boson calculation and feel something close to vertigo. None of these experiences cancels out the others. They occupy the same moment in the same episode simultaneously, each one available to exactly the audience equipped to receive it. Singh's observation that The Simpsons is the most mathematical television program in the history of primetime broadcasting is not an exaggeration constructed for promotional effect. The evidence across the show's run is genuine and substantial. The writing staff that produced the golden era of the show brought real technical knowledge into the writer's room and found consistent ways to insert it into the comedy without disrupting the comedy's primary function. The mathematical content never becomes the point of an episode in the way that would require a general audience to engage with it to enjoy what they are watching. It exists alongside the comedy, accessible to those equipped to find it and completely invisible to those who are not. That balance, maintained across years of production at a pace that left limited room for the kind of careful, deliberate construction that single-instance Easter eggs allow, is the most remarkable aspect of the mathematical tradition the show built. The Higgs boson was confirmed in 2012. The equation on Homer's blackboard had been sitting in a television archive for 14 years by then, not predicting the discovery in any meaningful causal sense, but reflecting the same theoretical landscape that the physicists working on the problem had been navigating. When Singh brought the parallel to public attention in the context of his book and the media coverage that accompanied it, the reaction was a combination of delight and mild disbelief, the familiar response to any revelation that something significant had been hiding in plain sight for longer than anyone expected. A number on a cartoon blackboard. 14 years of waiting. A Nobel Prize awarded to the physicist whose work the number was quietly circling. The Simpsons did not predict the Higgs boson, but someone who worked on the show understood enough about the physics to write an equation that pointed in the right direction, and that equation aired on national television more than a decade before the particle it described was confirmed to exist. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Blackboard in Homer's Inventor episode contained a near-miss solution to one of mathematics' greatest problems, and a calculation that pointed toward a subatomic particle nobody had yet confirmed, placed there by a writing staff whose mathematical training ran deeper than any comedy room had any reasonable right to expect. The next section moves from the language of numbers to the language of music, and to the moment a former Beatle recorded a real recipe in reverse and hid it inside the closing credits of a cartoon episode. Section 8. The song that played backwards. Paul McCartney agreed to appear on The Simpsons under conditions. This is worth establishing at the outset because the conditions themselves reveal something about the man and about the particular creative transaction that produced one of the most genuinely surprising Easter eggs in the show's history. McCartney was, by the mid-1990s, one of the most famous human beings alive, a figure whose cultural footprint was so large and so long established that his willingness to participate in any project carried automatic significance regardless of what the project asked him to do. He did not need The Simpsons. The show needed him, or wanted him, in the way that any comedy series wants the participation of a legend, for the credibility and the attention that a name of that magnitude brings with it. McCartney had other reasons for saying yes, and those reasons shaped everything about what he and the show produced together. together. The episode was called Lisa the Vegetarian, and it aired in the 7th season, in October of 1995. The story centered on Lisa's decision to stop eating meat after a visit to a petting zoo where she formed an attachment to a lamb, and the conflict that decision created within a family whose enthusiasm for meat, particularly in the form of Homer's passionate devotion to pork products of every variety, was a foundational character trait. Lisa's vegetarianism put her in opposition to her father, to her school, and to the broader culture of Springfield, which treated her position as eccentric at best and as a form of social aggression at worst. The episode was, in the way the best Lisa-centered episodes always were, genuinely sympathetic to a child trying to hold a principled position in an environment that found principle inconvenient. McCartney's conditions for appearing were two. The first applied to the episode itself. If Lisa became a vegetarian in this installment, she had to remain one. The commitment could not be reversed in a later episode for the sake of a joke or a plot convenience. The Simpsons had a well-established creative habit of resetting its characters to their default states at the end of each episode, a structural feature of the show that allowed it to tell any story without being constrained by the continuity those stories generated. McCartney understood this and wanted a guarantee that Lisa's vegetarianism would not become a temporary condition, a character detail tried and discarded when it stopped being useful. He wanted the change to be real within the show's internal logic, permanent in whatever sense permanence could be said to exist for a character who never aged and whose world refreshed itself every week. The showrunners agreed, and Lisa Simpson has remained a vegetarian across every episode the show has produced from that point to the present day, across hundreds of installments and decades of production, because a musician who cared about animal rights asked for a commitment before he would lend his voice to a cartoon. The second condition applied not to the episode but to a different production entirely. McCartney was also negotiating with ABC at that time about the network's coverage of the Beatles anthology, an exhaustive documentary series and accompanying album project that was arriving in 1995 as the most significant Beatles release in years. His condition for ABC was that the network would not air advertisements for Kentucky Fried Chicken during the anthology broadcasts. He was a vegetarian and an animal rights advocate, and he was not willing to have his participation in a major retrospective of his life's work surrounded by advertising for a company whose business he found morally objectionable. ABC agreed to that condition as well. McCartney's leverage as a cultural figure was sufficient to extract commitments from a broadcast television network about its commercial content, which is an unusual position to be negotiating from and an unusual concession to receive. With those terms established, McCartney and his wife Linda appeared in the episode as themselves, voicing animated versions of their own faces in a scene set on the roof of the Quick E-Mart, where Apu maintained a private rooftop garden. The location was itself a quiet Beatles reference, designed to evoke the famous rooftop concert the band had performed on the roof of the Apple Records building in London in 1969, one of their last public performances, and one of the most mythologized moments in rock history. The Apu connection was established through the episode's internal logic. Apu was a vegetarian, McCartney and Linda were vegetarians, and the shared rooftop space became the meeting point where Springfield's most unexpected community of values could briefly assemble. The scene where McCartney delivers the line that matters most to this story involves the backwards message tradition associated with Beatles recordings. From the mid-1960s onward, a subset of intensely devoted fans had been playing Beatles records in reverse, convinced that deliberate hidden messages had been encoded into the music by playing certain passages backwards during recording. The practice intensified dramatically around the Paul is Dead conspiracy, a widespread and genuinely remarkable piece of collective mythology that emerged in 1969 and claimed that Paul McCartney had died in a car accident in 1966 and had been replaced by a look-alike, with clues to his death hidden throughout subsequent Beatles recordings for those willing to listen carefully enough. The backwards messages that believers claimed to hear in various Beatles tracks were treated as confessions, confirmations, coded acknowledgments of the substitution. None of it was true. Paul McCartney was alive, was demonstrably Paul McCartney, and has spent portions of every subsequent decade of his public life gently and sometimes humorously deflecting the conspiracy that will apparently follow him to the end of his days. In the episode, speaking to Lisa on Apu's rooftop, McCartney's animated self himself tells her that if she plays his 1970 song Maybe I'm Amazed backwards, she will find a recipe for a really ripping lentil soup. The joke operates on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a parody of the backwards message tradition, deflating the conspiratorial urgency of those claims by replacing the supposed hidden messages about death and deception with something as mundane and wholesome as a soup recipe. Underneath the surface joke is the show's familiar affection for the gag that actually delivers what it promises. The joke sets up an expectation. It invites a viewer with the means and inclination to reverse a piece of music in search of a hidden message. And unlike the Beatles' conspiracy theories that inspired it, which produced nothing coherent when the records were actually played backwards, this joke pays off completely. McCartney recorded himself reciting a lentil soup recipe. He then had that recording played in reverse, producing an audio track in which his voice delivering the recipe is the backwards version of a forwards recording. That reversed version was embedded into the end credits of the episode, played over an altered version of Maybe I'm Amazed as the credits rolled. A viewer watching the episode in 1995 on broadcast television would have heard the credits music and registered something slightly unusual in the texture of the audio, a vocal element that sounded like backwards speech without being identifiable as anything specific. The episode ended. The television moved on. The viewers who were determined enough to actually reverse the audio found what McCartney had put there. His voice, reading his recipe. 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil, 1 medium onion, chopped, 1 cup of carrots, chopped, 2 sticks of celery, chopped, 1 clove of garlic, crushed, half a cup of lentils, a bay leaf, a tablespoon of freshly chopped parsley, salt and freshly ground pepper, 2 1/4 cups of vegetable stock or water. The recipe is complete and functional, a real thing that a person could take into a kitchen and use to produce a real soup. McCartney did not record a pastiche of a recipe or a joke version of one. He recorded the actual instructions, specific and usable, and hid them in the backwards audio of a credit sequence on a cartoon show about a dysfunctional family in a fictional American town. At the end of the recipe, after the last instruction has been delivered and the soup has been described in sufficient detail to produce it, McCartney added 3 words, and by the way, then a pause, and then, I'm alive. The words are a direct acknowledgement of the Paul is dead conspiracy, delivered from inside a backwards message hidden in the end credits of a Simpsons episode, emerging from a reversed recording of a song McCartney wrote for his first wife, wrapped in a parody of the exact cultural phenomenon it was referencing. It is a joke that operates at multiple removes simultaneously. A comedian's joke about a conspiracy theorist's joke about a dead man who was never dead, delivered in the format the conspiracy theorists invented and proved, by its own existence and its own coherent content, that backwards messages in Beatles recordings contained exactly as much hidden meaning as Paul McCartney chose to put in them, which in this case was a recipe and a brief confirmation that he was still breathing. The technical execution of the Easter egg is worth examining for a moment because it is more complex than it appears. Hiding a real recipe in a backwards recording is not simply a matter of recording the recipe and then reversing the tape. The reversed audio of a spoken recording sounds nothing like speech. Consonants that end words become sounds that begin them when played backwards. The rhythms of language invert in ways that produce an audio texture that registers as speech-like without being comprehensible as specific words. For the reversed version to sound like McCartney reading a recipe, the forwards version, from which it was derived, had to be constructed with the acoustic properties of the final backwards version in mind. This is a considerably more demanding technical task than it might seem. And the fact that the reversed audio is as legible as it is reflects genuine care in the production of the original recording. McCartney and whoever worked with him on the audio were not simply pressing a button to reverse a normal spoken recording. They were engineering a piece of audio specifically designed to function as comprehensible speech when heard in reverse. The discovery of the backwards recipe traveled through fan communities and eventually into mainstream media coverage in ways that tracked the broader pattern of how Simpsons Easter eggs became known. In the years immediately following the episode's broadcast, the reversal required physical effort, access to audio editing equipment, or a reel-to-reel recorder that could run tape backwards. As digital tools became widely accessible, the barrier dropped. Fan recordings of the reversed audio began circulating, the recipe became a known quantity within Simpsons fan communities, and the story eventually escaped those communities into general media coverage of the show's hidden content. McCartney confirmed the egg in various contexts over the years, acknowledging both the recipe and the I'm alive punchline, with the relaxed good humor of a person who found the whole thing funny rather than precious. What makes the McCartney Easter egg distinct from most of the others discussed in this video is the degree of genuine personal investment it represents from the celebrity involved. Most guest appearances on The Simpsons ask the celebrity to perform, to voice a character, deliver lines written by the show's writers, and lend their name and voice to a production that has constructed an episode around the opportunity of having them there. McCartney did that, voicing himself in a scene built around his vegetarianism and his connection to a tradition that the show found comedically useful. But he also did something beyond performing. He went into a recording studio and recorded a real recipe, backwards, with sufficient technical care that the reversed version would actually be audible as speech, for the purpose of hiding that recording inside the end credits of a television episode that most of the people who watched it would never examine that closely. He did extra work, private work that required its own separate creative and technical effort, purely for the benefit of the fraction of the audience determined enough to find it. That willingness to invest in the hidden layer rather than simply deliver the visible performance is the quality that makes the McCartney credits sequence genuinely surprising, even for a show whose habit of hiding things in its own fabric should have prepared any attentive viewer to expect it. The show asked for a guest appearance and received a guest appearance plus a piece of audio engineering designed to reward the most dedicated kind of fan attention with something specific, usable, and funny. A working soup recipe, a 3-word response to a decades-old rumor, hidden in a reverse recording embedded in a credit sequence that most viewers let play out without listening to it closely, on a broadcast television show in 1995, when the tools required to actually access the hidden content were available to only a small fraction of even the most enthusiastic audience. Linda McCartney, who appears alongside Paul in the episode and who was at that point in her life one of the most prominent advocates for vegetarian cooking in the English-speaking world, having published vegetarian cookbooks that sold in significant numbers, would have had her own feelings about the recipe being the substance of the hidden message. The choice of a lentil soup recipe, specifically, as the content of the backwards audio was not arbitrary. It was a functional extension of the episode's central subject, a practical expression of the vegetarian values that McCartney had made a condition of his participation, hidden in a format that made finding it an act of dedication rather than passive consumption. The joke rewarded effort with something genuinely useful, a recipe that worked, from a musician who meant it, delivered through one of the most technically unusual hiding places in the history of television Easter eggs. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Paul McCartney recorded a real recipe backwards and hid it in the closing credits of a cartoon episode, ending it with 3 words that answered a conspiracy theory that had followed him for nearly 30 years. The next section moves from what a celebrity hid inside the show to what the show's creator hid inside his most famous character, a signature so small and so consistent that it appeared in every episode for decades before most viewers ever thought to look for it. Section 9. The signature, hidden in plain sight. There is a particular kind of creative signature that does not announce itself. It does not appear in credits or commentary or interviews given to promote the work. It exists inside the work itself, embedded in the visual fabric of something that millions of people look at without quite seeing, placed there by the person who made the thing as a private mark of authorship, a way of saying this came from me without saying it in any language that the casual observer would recognize as speech. The caricaturist Al Hirschfeld spent decades hiding his daughter's name inside the lines of his published drawings, tucking the letters N-I-N-A into the folds of a subject's clothing or the waves of their hair, and readers who knew the game spent years finding Nina in the pages of newspapers and magazines, looking for her the way a person looks for a face they know in a crowd. The pleasure of the tradition was the combination of intimacy and concealment, the sense of a private relationship maintained in public without the public being required to participate in it. Matt Groening has his own version of this practice. It is not hidden in the same way Hirschfeld's Ninas were hidden, requiring active searching through fine lines and intricate detail. It is hidden in a much more exposed location, in the most recognizable character in one of the most watched television programs ever produced, visible in every episode and in every piece of licensed merchandise and in every promotional image the show has ever generated. It has been on screen in various forms since the show first aired in 1989, and the majority of viewers who have spent hundreds of hours watching Homer Simpson move through his life in Springfield have spent all of those hours looking at it without registering what they were seeing. When Homer is viewed in profile, which is one of the standard angles at which his character model appears throughout the show, his silhouette contains two letters. The shape of his hair, the two small curls that rise from the top of his otherwise bald head, forms the letter M. The shape of his ear, the simple curved line that defines the side of his head, forms the letter G. M and G. The initials of Matthew Abram Groening, the man who sketched the character in a waiting room in 1987, in the minutes before a pitch meeting that changed his professional life entirely. The signature is there in every profile view, in every episode, on every piece of merchandise produced using the standard character model, and it was placed there deliberately, encoded into the design of the character at the level of his most basic visual construction. Groening confirmed the intention of the design on a season 16 episodes DVD commentary, discussing it with the directness of someone who had never particularly tried to hide the fact that the signature was there, simply because it had never been widely noticed and there was therefore nothing to deny. The show itself acknowledged the design in that same season 16 episode, in a moment that made the signature briefly explicit within the narrative of the show, rather than leaving it solely in the realm of background knowledge. But the acknowledgement in the show was brief and did not linger, and the majority of the audience who were watching did not take it as an invitation to go back and look at every previous episode with the signature in mind. It registered as a joke and moved on, which is more or less how every self-referential moment in a comedy tends to work. The design choice is more interesting when placed in the context of how quickly the character was created. The entire Simpson family was sketched in the lobby outside James L. Brooks's office in the time available before a pitch meeting, which sources across various accounts suggest was a matter of minutes rather than hours. Groening was working without a desk, without reference materials, without the infrastructure of a proper design process. He was producing rough character outlines from instinct and memory, naming them after members of his own family, giving them the basic visual features that would define them for decades to come. That the initials found their way into Homer's profile in those circumstances, whether as a conscious decision made in the moment or as a feature recognized and retained after the fact, reflects a kind of design economy that is itself characteristic of how the show was built. Dense with meaning, light on ceremony, hiding what it means inside what it shows. The M of Homer's hair is relatively easy to see once it has been pointed out. The two curls that sit on top of his head produce a shape that, when the character is viewed from the side, reads clearly as the letter. The G of his ear is slightly more subtle because the ear shape used for Homer is not dramatically different from the ear shape used for other characters in the show. Most of the Simpson family and many of the recurring Springfield residents share a similar ear design, a simple curved line that is a standard animation shorthand for an ear viewed in profile. The G reading requires a specific way of looking at the curve, a willingness to see the letter in the shape rather than simply the anatomical feature the shape is representing. Once that reading is available, though, it does not disappear. The ear becomes the G permanently, in the way that all such visual revelations work. Irreversible once made, impossible to unsee. The broader question of how many people noticed the signature before the show chose to acknowledge it is one that the available record does not answer cleanly. Fan communities that devoted serious attention to the show's visual details were discussing it before the season 16 episode made it explicit, and the detail appeared in lists of hidden Simpsons facts that circulated through early internet culture in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But the signature was not one of the show's most widely known Easter eggs in the way the McBain movie or the Maggie register number eventually became, in part because it required no particular event to bring it to attention, no assembled video or paused frame that could be shared and spread. It was simply always there, in every episode, waiting for anyone whose angle of attention happened to align with Groening's angle of concealment. The Danny Elfman connection operates on a similar principle of embedded authorship, though in a different location and at a different level of visibility. Elfman composed the theme music for The Simpsons in 1989, producing the piece that has opened every episode of the show across its entire run and that has become one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the history of American television. He wrote it quickly. By his own account in various interviews, he composed the tune during the drive home from his initial meeting with Groening. in which Groening showed him a rough edit of the opening sequence and described the kind of music he was looking for. Elfman said the sequence had such a classic feel that it suggested something retro to him, and the melody arrived rapidly, fully formed enough to record a demo in his home studio later the same day. He has described it as one of his easiest compositions and simultaneously as the most popular thing he has ever written, a combination that creates its own kind of irony for a composer who has spent decades producing scores for major films. Elfman's name is hidden in the opening credits sequence of the show. In the moments just after the clouds part and the title card appears, the camera moves through a view of Springfield that includes storefronts along a street. In the window of one of those storefronts, visible briefly as the camera passes, the word Danny appears twice. The double appearance is a reference to Elfman's first name, a small acknowledgement of the composer embedded in the opening sequence at precisely the moment when his music begins to play. The timing is the signature. The word Danny appears in the storefront as the theme starts, connecting the hidden text to the music in a way that rewards any viewer who notices both simultaneously. The Elfman name in the storefront is less well known than the Groening initials in Homer's design, partly because it requires a specific angle of attention to the background of a fast-moving opening sequence rather than a re-examination of the central character's most familiar visual feature. The opening credits move quickly. The storefront is one element among many in a pan across Springfield that is primarily designed to establish the show's setting and introduce the family members as they converge from their separate daily activities toward the couch. A viewer watching the opening for the 100th time is not looking at storefronts. They are watching Homer narrowly avoid being hit by Bart's skateboard, or registering which couch gag the show has chosen for this particular episode, or simply letting the familiar sequence wash over them as an indicator that the episode is about to begin. The Elfman reference requires a different mode of attention than the one the opening sequence naturally generates, which is why it remained unnoticed by most viewers across the years it was sitting there. Both signatures, Groening's initials in Homer's profile and Elfman's name in the opening's background, belong to a category of hidden authorship that differs from the Easter eggs discussed elsewhere in this video. The McBain movie, the Maggie register number, the Skinner prisoner designation, the A113 classroom reference, the Paul McCartney backwards recipe, all of these are things the show placed in its own fabric as gifts for the attentive viewer, jokes or references that reward the person who finds them with a sense of discovery and the pleasure of decoding something hidden. The authorial signatures are slightly different in their function. They are not gifts for the audience so much as marks of ownership, the creative equivalent of a painter signing a canvas, except that the signature has been folded into the image itself rather than placed in a corner where everyone can see it. They declare authorship without making the declaration visible to the casual viewer, which is a paradox that the Hirschfeld tradition Groening explicitly admired was always built around. The paradox has a particular quality when the signed work is a collaborative production of the scale that The Simpsons represents. A comic strip is made by one person. A signature in a comic strip is an unambiguous statement of individual authorship. A television show is made by hundreds of people across decades of production, writers and directors and animators and voice actors and composers and editors and producers, all contributing to a collective output that any single signature can only partially claim. Groening's initials in Homer's design are the signature of the show's creator on the show's central character, a mark that says "this is mine," in a context where the truth is considerably more complex than any single possessive pronoun can capture. The show belongs to the people who made it, which is a large and changing group of people across nearly 4 decades, and Groening's signature in the character design is simultaneously accurate and incomplete, a true statement that does not contain the whole truth. What both signatures share, beyond their function as marks of authorship, is the quality of patience they embody. Groening's initials have been present in Homer's profile since before the show was a show, since the rough sketches made in a waiting room became refined character designs, became the model used to produce every episode across every season the show has aired. Elfman's name has been in the opening sequence since the first episode. Neither signature was placed with any expectation that it would be widely noticed. Neither was promoted or discussed in the show's early years in ways that would have directed viewer attention toward it. They were placed and left, in the confidence that their presence was sufficient, regardless of whether anyone ever found them, and in the awareness that the show's visual texture was rich enough that 2 additional hidden details would simply become part of the fabric without disrupting anything around them. The discovery of both, when it happened, produced the particular pleasure that this kind of authorial secret tends to generate, the feeling of having been in the presence of something without without knowing it, of having looked at a thing 1,000 times and seen it correctly every time while simultaneously missing its deepest layer of meaning. Homer Simpson in profile is Homer Simpson. He has always been Homer Simpson. He has also always been Matt Groening's initials, visible in the most basic geometry of his silhouette, present in the design from the first sketch. The opening theme is the opening theme. It has always been the opening theme. And somewhere in the background of the street through which the camera moves at its beginning, before the music has properly started, and before any viewer has focused their attention on anything in particular, the name of the man who wrote that music is written on a window in the few seconds before the show begins. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Groening's initials have been sitting in Homer's silhouette since the character was first sketched, and Danny Elfman's name has been waiting in the opening sequence since the very first episode. Two signatures hidden in plain sight across decades of episodes watched by hundreds of millions of people. The final section brings all of these discoveries together and asks the question that runs underneath every one of them. Section 10. The culture of hiding things in plain sight. When a show runs for nearly 4 decades and produces more episodes than any other scripted program in the history of American television, the question of what holds it together across that span becomes genuinely interesting. The cast changes, the writing staff turns over, the animation technology advances from hand-drawn cells produced in Korean studios to digital workflows that would be unrecognizable to the people who made the first season. The cultural context shifts underneath the show continuously, the references that land in one decade landing differently in the next, the satire that felt urgent at one moment becoming nostalgic at another. Showrunners come and go. The network relationship evolves. The audience, which is not the same audience it was when the show debuted on a December night in 1989, grows older and is replaced by new viewers who encounter the show through streaming and social media rather than through the act of sitting in front of a television at a specific time on a specific night of the week. Through all of that change, something has remained consistent enough to give the show its particular identity across its entire run. The question of what that thing is leads, eventually, back to every discovery this video has discussed. The writing culture that produced the golden era of the show was unusual in ways that went beyond the obvious markers of quality. The staff that assembled during the first several seasons was constitutionally inclined toward a specific kind of intellectual play, the kind that rewards preparation and punishes passivity, that constructs jokes at multiple levels simultaneously and trusts the audience to find whatever level they are equipped to access. That inclination had roots in the educational backgrounds of the people involved. Mathematics degrees from elite universities, doctorates in technical disciplines, training in the rigorous formal analysis of complex systems. The kind of mind that spends years studying mathematics or computer science or physics develops a particular relationship with hidden structure, with the pleasure of encoding meaning in forms that require specific tools to decode and rewarding the decoder with something genuinely satisfying rather than something merely decorative. That relationship between technical training and comedic sensibility is not obvious from the outside. Comedy seems like a different discipline from mathematics, operating through different instincts and rewarding different skills. But the writers who worked on the show during its most celebrated period have articulated, in interviews and commentaries and the occasional essay, a connection between the two that makes intuitive sense once it is stated. One of the show's mathematically trained writers described it in terms that Singh quoted in his book. The mathematical mind lends itself naturally to very silly jokes, because logic is at the heart of mathematics, and the more a person thinks about logic, the more they find pleasure in twisting and subverting it. The illogical is only fully funny to someone who understands the logical well enough to feel exactly how far the departure goes. Comedy built on subverted expectations requires a precise understanding of the expectations being subverted, and that precision is a form of the same analytical clarity that mathematics demands. The Easter eggs and hidden details this video has cataloged are products of that culture operating in a specific mode, the mode of building for the long term, of constructing things that will be found later rather than immediately, of treating the show's visual and auditory texture as a space that extends beyond what any single viewer could access in a single viewing at broadcast speed. Every discovery discussed here required either time or tools or knowledge that the average viewer did not have at the moment of original broadcast. The McBain movie required someone to gather clips from multiple episodes episodes and play them in sequence, a task that became possible only when streaming and digital archives made every episode instantly accessible. The Maggie register number required either a sharp eye and a VCR with excellent pause capabilities, or the slower revelation that came when DVD releases made frame-by-frame examination easy. The Skinner prisoner number required knowledge of a 19th century French novel and the patience to connect a detail from Season 5 to a reveal in Season 9. The Paul McCartney recipe required audio equipment capable of reversing a recording and the determination to apply it to the end credits of a cartoon. The graining initials required a specific angle of attention to the most familiar character in the show, the willingness to look at something seen hundreds of times and ask whether there was anything left to see. None of these things were designed for easy discovery. They were designed for eventual discovery, which is a meaningfully different standard. Easy discovery rewards the casual viewer who happens to look in the right direction at the right moment. Eventual discovery rewards the viewer who keeps looking, who returns to the same material with fresh attention, who brings new knowledge to something previously seen, and finds that the new knowledge changes what the old material contains. The show was built for both types of viewing simultaneously, delivering an immediately accessible comedy to the casual viewer, while maintaining a second layer of content that only revealed itself to the viewer who approached it differently. That simultaneity is the defining characteristic of the Easter egg culture the show developed, and it is the thing that makes the discoveries feel genuinely surprising, rather than simply confirmatory. The tradition of hiding things was not limited to the Golden Era. Writers who joined the show in later seasons inherited a culture that valued the practice and continued it, placing things in backgrounds and credits and character designs with the awareness that what they were doing was part of a tradition older than their own tenures. The A113 reference, which Brad Bird began placing in the show during his 8 seasons as a creative figure in its early years, has continued appearing in later episodes produced by people who may never have studied at CalArts, but who understood that the reference was part of the show's visual vocabulary and treated it as such. The mathematical jokes have appeared in episodes produced well beyond the Golden Era, because the writing staff continued to recruit people with technical backgrounds who brought the same impulse to embed real knowledge in the comedy. The tradition did not belong to any specific era. It belonged to the culture. That culture had a specific attitude toward its audience that is worth naming directly. The show did not hide things as a form of condescension, as a way of separating the sophisticated viewers from the unsophisticated ones, and rewarding the former at the expense of the latter. The comedy worked for every viewer, regardless of whether they caught any of the hidden content. Homer's adventures were funny without the initials in his profile. The opening credits were iconic without Danny Elfman's name in the storefront window. Skinner's character was rich and interesting without the prisoner number that foreshadowed his identity reveal. The hidden layer added something but did not subtract anything for those who never found it. This is the crucial distinction between Easter eggs as they function in the Simpsons tradition and Easter eggs as they sometimes function in other contexts, where hidden content can feel like a test that rewards insiders and excludes everyone else. The show's hidden content was always additive, always surplus, always a gift rather than a gate. The attitude toward the audience that produced this approach was fundamentally optimistic. It assumed that some viewers would be curious enough, attentive enough, and knowledgeable enough to find what had been hidden, without assuming that all viewers needed to meet that standard to enjoy the show fully. It trusted the audience to be various, to contain multitudes, to include both the person watching casually after a long day and the person pausing and rewinding and cross-referencing and bringing their knowledge of 19th century French literature to bear on a detail glimpsed for a fraction of a second in the background of a scene about a high school barbershop quartet. Both viewers were welcome. The show worked for both. The second viewer simply found more. The fan communities that developed around the show, particularly in the early years of internet culture when dedicated forums and websites created infrastructure for collective close reading of popular texts, became the primary mechanism through which the hidden content was found and shared. Individual viewers who noticed something unusual could post their discovery in a space where other attentive viewers could verify it, extend it, and connect it to other discoveries. The McBain hidden movie became known because someone assembled the clips and posted the result. The Skinner prisoner number was confirmed by fans who recognized the Les Miserables reference and tracked down the original episode to verify the specific digits. The McCartney recipe was decoded by fans with audio audio software who then shared the reversed recording online. The fan community was doing the work that the show's structure invited: sustained, collective, cross-referential attention applied to a text that had been built to reward exactly that kind of reading. The relationship between the show's hidden content and the fan culture that found it is a two-directional one. The hidden content shaped the fan culture by giving it something genuinely worth finding, by rewarding attentive collective reading with real discoveries rather than manufactured ones. The fan culture shaped the show by demonstrating that the hidden content was being found, that the investment of creative energy in things no single viewer could access alone was producing responses that the show's producers could see and appreciate. The writers who placed Easter eggs in later seasons did so knowing that the audience had become sophisticated enough to find them, that the infrastructure of fan attention had grown capable enough to eventually surface almost anything hidden in the show's visual or auditory texture. The Easter egg culture became self-sustaining. Each discovery encouraged the next. Each confirmed hidden detail increased the motivation to look for the next one. This dynamic has extended into the contemporary moment, where the combination of streaming access to every episode, social media platforms capable of spreading a discovery to millions of people in hours, and digital tools that make frame-by-frame analysis effortless has created conditions for Simpsons discovery that would have been unimaginable to the writers who produced the early seasons. The McBain movie was found initially in 2011, more than 15 years after the clips that composed it first aired, and went viral again in 2024 through a single social media post that reached an audience the original viral moment could not have touched. The Maggie register number has been rediscovered repeatedly by new generations of viewers encountering the show through streaming and finding their way to the explanation through the same combination of curiosity and digital search that now mediates most encounters with unfamiliar information. Each rediscovery introduces the tradition to a new audience that then becomes part of the ongoing culture of looking. What does all of this looking reveal, finally, about the people who built the show? It reveals that they were working at a level of engagement with their own material that went beyond what the format required or what the audience could reliably access. A weekly comedy series produced on a network television schedule does not need to contain real Fermat near-miss solutions or working lentil soup recipes embedded in reversed audio or prisoner numbers that foreshadow character revelations 4 seasons in advance. None of those things were required. None of them were commissioned. None of them were guaranteed to be found. They were placed because the people placing them found the act of placement satisfying, because the culture of the writing room valued depth over display and rewarded the builder of hidden structures even when those structures remained hidden. The show was, in this sense, partly made for itself, for the pleasure of the people making it, for the internal satisfaction of producing something richer than the format demanded. That is a particular kind of artistic seriousness, not the kind that announces itself through prestige or awards or the explicit signaling of cultural importance, but the kind that simply builds more carefully than it needs to and trusts that the extra care will eventually be recognized by someone. The Simpsons earned its reputation as one of the greatest television programs ever made through its most visible qualities: the precision of its satire, the depth of its characters, the consistency of its comedy across a sustained run that most programs cannot approach. But underneath those visible qualities, supporting them and enriching them and extending them into registers that most viewers never consciously accessed, was the culture of hiding things in plain sight that every discovery in this video has illuminated. The McBain movie and the rabbit ears and the register number and the prisoner designation and the classroom reference and the mathematical blackboard and the backwards recipe and the initials in the profile and the composer's name in the window, all of them are expressions of the same underlying sensibility, the same commitment to building more than is strictly necessary, the same faith that someone eventually will look closely enough to find what has been left for them. That faith has been rewarded, across decades, by the community of viewers who took the show seriously enough to look. Every discovery documented in this video represents a moment when the patience of the builders met the patience of the finders, when something placed without any guarantee of recognition was finally recognized by someone with exactly the right combination of knowledge and attention and willingness to look again at something they thought they already knew. The show built a world rich enough to reward that looking indefinitely. The looking continues. The world is still there, still containing things things not yet found, still waiting for the viewer who happens to look in the right direction at the right moment and sees, in the familiar silhouette of a bald cartoon man in profile, the initials of the person who drew him in a waiting room 37 years ago and hid himself inside the drawing before anyone had seen it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.